Aloha, my loves, and welcome to another episode of Soulful Wahine. Last week, we explored emotional loneliness, an experience that so many of us have lived through, but never really had the language to describe it. And one of my favorite parts about sharing that episode was hearing so many of you say, I finally understand what I've been feeling. As I've been sitting with that conversation, another question kept coming to mind for me. And that is, why do so many of us feel like we have to convince ourselves that we're allowed to feel our feelings before we ever let ourselves explore them? Maybe you've caught yourself saying, I'm just overreacting. I'm probably being too sensitive. Other people have it worse. Or I shouldn't let this bother me. If that sounds familiar, today's episode is for you. Because before we can understand why we do this, we first have to recognize what we're actually doing. Here's what's interesting. Most of us don't wake up thinking, I'm going to invalidate my own emotions today. No. But instead, it feels like you're being logical. It feels like you're trying to see both sides, and it feels like you're trying to be fair. So instead of exploring our own emotions, we immediately start to evaluate them. And that's where I think many of us unknowingly start making one really important mistake. We tend to confuse explaining our feelings with understanding them. Think about how often you've experienced something painful, only to immediately begin explaining it away. Maybe they didn't mean it. Maybe we're just tired. Maybe we're stressed. Maybe we're taking it too personally. Or maybe tomorrow we'll feel differently. Notice what's happening, folks. We are spending so much time explaining our feelings that we never actually stop to understand them. Which made me realize something, folks. Kind of like I touched on in our last episode, maybe we're asking ourselves the wrong questions. The question that keeps us stuck is, instead of us asking ourselves, what am I feeling? Many of us automatically ask, do I have a good enough reason to feel this? And while those questions might sound similar, they lead us in completely different directions. One creates curiosity, while the other creates self-doubt. And I think that one small shift changes everything. Because again, nobody is born believing they have to outright earn the right to feel things. Following along? Somewhere along the line, folks, we learned that our feelings needed permission. One thing that I've learned from being a therapist is children naturally express emotions. They cry, they laugh, they get frustrated, they feel disappointed. But they don't ever stop to wonder if those emotions are reasonable. So somewhere along the way, many of us learn that some emotions are easier for other people to handle compared to others. And slowly, we began to edit and change ourselves. But the lesson isn't always taught through words. Sometimes it's taught through experience. We don't just learn what to feel, but rather we learn what is safe to feel. As children, we're constantly learning what keeps us connected to the people around us. Maybe excitement was welcomed, but anger wasn't. Maybe happiness was celebrated, but sadness was brushed aside. And maybe you learned that being easygoing earned you more connection than being honest about your emotions. Over time, many of us stop expressing what we're actually feeling and start expressing what feels safest. And after enough time, the survival strategy can become part of our identity. I want to touch on the topic of when self-doubt feels safer than trust. Because over time, questioning ourselves can start to feel responsible, safer, or even more mature. So before we let ourselves believe, wow, that really hurt me, we immediately ask, well, am I sure? And eventually, self doubt becomes so familiar that we mistake it for emotional maturity. But constantly questioning ourselves comes with a cost. And the hidden cost of always second guessing yourself is when every feeling has to be justified, you stop trusting yourself. You replay conversations. You ask multiple people for reassurance. And you compare your pain to everyone else's. You wait for someone else to tell you whether or not your emotions and feelings make sense. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, your own voice becomes harder to hear. Which raises another question. What are our emotions actually asking of us? Maybe your feelings aren't asking to be proven. What if your emotions weren't asking you to prove that they were reasonable, but rather simply asking to be noticed? Not every emotion reflects objective reality, but every emotion reflects your internal experience. And your internal experience deserves curiosity before criticism. Okay? Maybe healing doesn't begin when we stop feeling. Maybe it begins when we stop putting our feelings on trial and having to explain why we feel them. Because if we can learn to become curious about our emotions instead of arguing with them, everything begins to shift and change. I want to throw out there, folks, that your feelings are not the problem, but maybe your relationship with them might be. Most of us don't struggle because we have emotions. We struggle because we've learned to fear them. We've learned that sadness means weakness, that anger means we're too much, that disappointment means we're ungrateful, that loneliness means something must be wrong with our relationships. So instead of listening to our emotions, we start trying to fix them before we've even taken a chance to understand them. And I think that's where one of the biggest misconceptions about emotions begin. Another thing I want to throw out is you don't have to agree with a feeling in order to explain it. Sometimes people hear this conversation and think, so are you saying that every feeling is right? No, that's not what I'm saying. What I am saying, though, is that feelings are instructions. Feelings are information. They're invitations for us to slow down, for us to be curious, and to ask ourselves, what is this emotion trying to show me? Because understanding an emotion isn't the same thing as acting on it. And I think curiosity is something that many of us were never taught. Think about the difference between these two questions. Why am I like this? Versus, I wonder why this affected me so deeply. One question assumes that there is something wrong with you, while the other assumes that there's something worth being understood here. And the goal isn't to become less emotional, but rather it's to become less afraid of our own emotional world and exploring it. And sometimes one small shift in perspective can completely change the conversation that you have with yourself. The next time that you notice yourself thinking, I'm probably overreacting, it's not that serious, maybe I'm just too sensitive, or I shouldn't feel this way, go ahead and pause. And then ask yourself, if I wasn't trying to convince myself that I shouldn't be feeling this, what might I actually be feeling? That question right there, folks, creates space. And sometimes space is exactly where healing begins. Because maybe the answer isn't to stop completely questioning ourselves. Does that make sense? Healthy self trust just means trusting yourself enough to explore your emotions before you dismiss them. And that's very different, folks, because you're not giving your emotions the final say. You're simply giving them a seat at the table. And I think that that's something that many of us have never experienced before. Imagine feeling hurt without immediately minimizing it. Imagine feeling disappointed without comparing your experience to somebody else's. Imagine feeling lonely without convincing yourself that you have no reason to be. Not because every emotion tells the whole story, but because every emotion deserves the chance to be heard before it's judged. Which brings me to the biggest takeaway from today's conversation. Maybe healing isn't becoming someone who never feels hurt or never feels pain. Maybe healing is becoming someone who no longer believes that they have to earn the right to have an emotional experience. Because your emotions don't need to win a debate before they're worthy of your curiosity. Okay? And that's the thought that I want to leave all of you with today. If there's one thing that I hope you all can take away from today's episode, it's this. You don't have to decide whether your emotions are justified before you become curious about them. You don't have to build a case. You don't have to compare your pain. And you don't have to convince yourself that you've suffered enough. Sometimes the most healing thing you can do is just simply pause and ask yourself, what is my emotional experience trying to tell me? Because that's often where understanding and compassion begins. I just wanted to say from the bottom of my heart, folks, thank you so much for being here for another episode of Soulful Wahine. I recognize that this week's episode is a little shorter than usual, but that's just because honestly, folks, with this season, I truly am wanting to get deeper. I'm wanting to hop into deeper topics. And in order for us to do that, I'm someone that kind of likes to ease my way in. And so if today's conversation helped you put language to an experience that you've been carrying, I hope that you'll share this episode with someone who might need to hear it too. Until next Friday, folks, please take care of yourself, be gentle with yourself, and always remember that you don't have to earn the right to be curious about your emotional experiences before judging them. As always, folks, thank you for being here. And until next time, mahalo and aloha.